Today we were just going to have a bit of a chit chat about anything that's cropped up and sort of see where it leads us. What kind of things did you want to talk about?
Yeah, I've got one particular thing that I want to talk about in some detail if we have time. But I wanted to mention first a photograph that's been making its way around on Facebook this week. It's a photograph of a young girl on a bicycle, and she stopped her bicycle in front of a wall. On the wall, there are two tallies. It's graffiti, I suppose. It says U.S. Soldiers 2009, and then the first tally is committed suicide, and it says 304 soldiers. The second tally is killed in Iraq, and it says 149 soldiers. So it's quite an arresting photo, and it has been doing the rounds. I was very interested in the numbers here, and I looked them up. And depending on which source you get your information from, these numbers are perhaps not entirely accurate, but they have drawn attention. This photo has drawn attention to a very serious issue, which is a spike in the suicide rate among U.S. troops in the last 5 years.
Yeah, see, I saw the same photo and I looked them up, and they seem, well, yeah, depending on which source, like you say. The sources I found, they seemed fairly accurate. At least the second one did, about the amount of soldiers that died in Iraq. The first one I actually found was higher suicide rate, 334.
Yeah, it has been. In 2009 was called by some media outlets the year of the soldier suicide, which is a really tragic thing, obviously. But after 2009, the numbers kind of plateaued, which is a very smooth and nice-sounding word for something very horrible. And then there was another spike in 2012. So I think this is something which is obviously not going away.
I believe that photo actually also was a photograph of a piece of artwork. This was actually a sort of political artwork by Banksy. Have you heard of him?
Yes. Yeah.
I believe that was a Banksy piece of work.
Yeah, I think you might be right. And it's a very powerful. It's a very powerful photograph, and it does reveal. I guess yet another dark side of the US's attempt, the US government's attempt to move into the next phase of warfare. Yeah? Because we had, well, as you know, and prior to World War One, war was quite a different thing. You had the soldier class of one country going out to fight the soldier class of another country, which is not to say that it wasn't horribly destructive. But in the 20th century, we had this, starting with World War One, this concept of the total war, where an entire society was at war with another society. And then I think in this century, we seem to have moved in the direction of a perpetual war. The kind of thing that Orwell quite presciently talked about in 1984, where there's a war against something quite abstract, and the war can't be ended because there is no point at which you can say, okay, we've won, and so we just keep sending troops out to shoot people.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, and this is one of the this is one form of one result is that we do have now a large number of people who go into military service and end their life as a result.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day because I think a lot of guys growing up, they get to play with soldiers and guns, and they play computer games with guns, and joining the army is quite an attractive prospect because you get to play with all this equipment. I can totally understand why someone would want to join the military. I've, in fact, when I was younger, I applied to join the Air Force. But I didn't actually get in because I was considered too old at 23. But so I can totally understand why anyone would do it. But I think these days, the wars that people are fighting in, they're not really protecting anyone. They're just protecting the interests of the global elite. And it does also seem, and this suicide rate compared to the amount of deaths in the military actually fighting in Iraq, may be another indicator of the fact that the actual governments don't really care that much about the actual military personnel and see them as a bit as cannon fodder.
Well, I think that's true, and I think it's very difficult to profile the average soldier. On the internet, of course, we do see footage of some deeply stupid people, heavily armed, and doing some deeply stupid things. But I don't believe that reflects every soldier who's out there, and I think for a lot of people, some of the truths about modern warfare have been laid bare, over these last 10 years. So, I mean, essentially now what we have is, as you say, fighting in the name of a privileged elite. You've got, I guess, two or three things happening in war these days, and none of them really are about defending your country in most cases. So you've basically got a redistribution of money from the taxpayer to private corporations. That's one of the major aims of war nowadays. Because when you start a war, you bring in all kinds of contractors. Halliburton is, of course, the most famous one. The contractors are allowed to dip into the public purse and take money from the taxpayer and add that to their balance sheet.
I remember when the first or the second Iraq war started. I remember watching on TV as they gave a press conference, and this general awarded out all the contracts. And the way they did it just seemed like they were just loving it. It was just this was a huge opportunity to give out all these contracts to all these big companies, and it was a bit distasteful to watch, really.
It is very distasteful, because that is now a major part of the reason to go to war, is so that a certain number of private interests can take money out of the public purse. So, as I say, it's a deliberate redistribution of income from the public purse into private hands. And of course, there's the goal of exerting control over energy resources. And I think an underappreciated reason for war as we know it now is control over currency markets. And the classic example is Iraq. A couple of years before the invasion, which was declared by George W. Bush, Saddam Hussein, who, as we know, had previously been an ally of the USA, a very trusted and valued ally, Saddam announced that he was going to start selling oil to the world in euros rather than US dollars. Now, the US dollar is not very well supported by currency reserves, and if it lost its currency as a means of buying oil in the world, that would be a massive blow to the US economy. So when you have people who are sitting on very large oil reserves saying, we don't want to use US dollars to buy and sell oil anymore, we're going to use another currency, that's a direct threat. That's a direct threat to the USA, or not to the USA as a nation, but to elites within the USA whose stocks of wealth rely on this being an exclusive currency for the buying and selling of oil. So when Saddam decided he was going to use euros, next thing you know, he was invaded. And guess who the next country was who decided they were going to do a similar thing?
Who's that?
Iran. They announced the same thing a few years later, and since then we've had constant rattling of sabers, in the direction of Iran. So it seems that if you dare to announce to the world that you're thinking of selling oil in euros rather than US dollars, you're on the shit list. And these are the kinds of reasons why people make wars nowadays.
Well, and also with direct threats as well. I mean, Putin sees what's happening in Ukraine as a direct threat. Now with the elections and Poroshenko looking likely to be the candidate, then that he's going to see that as a direct threat. So I don't think we've seen the end of the Ukrainian situation either.
No, I certainly don't think we have. But I mean, from the perspective of a soldier on the front line, there is a lot less reason to be there, I think, than there used to be. Wars have always been horrible. Anyone who has participated in one has seen things which the rest of us would find it difficult to cope with. But people who are involved in wars do cope with these things if they feel that there is sufficient reason to be there. So if, for example, they are defending their country or they're defending against a threat. So, World War II being the classic example with Nazism, obviously something which had to be stopped. The wars that we've seen in the last 10 years don't have that quality. It's very debatable as to whether it was a good idea to start those wars. And so in that context, you have people going into those situations seeing terrible things, seeing dead children and bloodied, burned corpses, and most of that being partly the result of those people being there. And I think that has to have an impact,
Yeah, and I think the propaganda war we see being played out in the media to sort of garner support amongst the public, although sometimes it is aimed at the public to get support, it's obviously clearly also aimed at the military, because by getting public support, you then you're also aiming your propaganda at the military to get them on board as well. Because if you didn't have public support, the families of the people that you're going to be fighting for, then the military would collapse.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I'm surprised it hasn't happened in certain cases. The Australian military, in my view, has been completely discredited. The activities in which they've been involved over the last 10 years are extremely morally questionable, and I think, and in some cases, not just questionable, but morally repugnant. They've allowed themselves to become politicized and to act on behalf of a political party to help that party win elections. And if that's the case, then that's not the role of the military to help a political party get over the line in a tight election. And once the military reduces itself to that kind of role, I don't think that anybody has any business joining. But in Australia, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who don't think that deeply.
I think there is a specific problem with Australia with who is recruited into the military. It has been said that a lot of soldiers are stupid. Perhaps you could say they are perhaps naive or troublesome personalities who don't necessarily slot well into civil society.
I wonder if it's less to do with people who are of lower intelligence and more to do with a certain category of people in society that watch certain TV programs and have fit into a certain sector of society that, yeah, they have their families. A lot of people in the military have families. They watch these soap operas. They tend to be those kind of people rather than maybe stupid people. People who watch the kind of things that will actually get them into the mindset. They watch the daytime TV programs and they get fed the kind of propaganda that maybe some people who watch other stuff don't see that, and they see beyond some of what the world leaders are up to.
I think that's very true, and I mean it is, as I said before, it is impossible to generalize. But unfortunately, it is a specific problem in Australia that, to give you an example of how this works in day-to-day basis, there are certain times of the year called recce when army personnel are on holiday essentially and are allowed to visit the city that's closest to their base. That city will very often clear out because they don't want the trouble that the army will bring when they go out drinking in that city. They can be a very, very unpleasant presence in civilian society.
I know that. I mean, I've lived in the home of the British Army in England, so I know that you tend to get bars where only the military go to, and you kind of avoid those places because the military are trained to fight. Mm-hmm. And so it's no accident if you go to a military bar, there's going to be fights breaking out a fair amount,
Yeah, that's right. But as I said, I think the more serious issue is why would anybody join the military in this day and age? I mean, and again, I'm not generalizing to all militaries, but in the case of the Australian military, there was a case in, I believe it was 2003. The Conservative government was up for re-election, but was having difficulty enthusing the population to re-elect them because, well, they'd been bastards, basically, and had sold the country to Rupert Murdoch. But, you know, this was one of the first times when this incredibly stupid idea of Australian border security came up as an election issue. There's a long tradition now of using border security as a way to win elections. And targeting these people who are called boat people in Australia. These are people who illegally come to Australia and try to settle there because they're seeking asylum from the countries which they've fled from. And in Australia, there's a big campaign to stop these people coming. Now, in actual fact, the number of people who come to Australia each year by these means is about 2,000, which is a drop in the ocean. You know, it's a drop in the ocean in comparison to the overall number of immigrants which Australia accepts each year, and it's a drop in the ocean in comparison to the number of immigrants accepted in other places. It's a huge issue about almost nothing, and it's resulted in an incredible amount of cruelty, needless cruelty, to people who are, in 99% of cases, in desperate circumstances and in need of some understanding, not more cruelty. But there was one particular incident in, I believe it was 2003. The Conservative government were trying to get back in. There was an election campaign coming up, and a boat approached the Australian coastline. It was being skippered by a person who Australians call a people smuggler, an Indonesian who's agreed to transport people to Australia to try and get asylum there. Yeah. So the people smuggler, and I use that expression in inverted commas, brings the boat close to Australia. Yeah, and then what we see on television is there's a confrontation with the Australian military who says you can't come into Australia. And then in order to force the hand of the military to take these people into Australia, the people smuggler then starts throwing children into the ocean. Right? That's what we saw on television. That's not what actually happened. And in actual fact, the Australian Navy colluded in setting up that situation for the cameras so that the media of the country could show a people smuggler throwing kids into the ocean when in fact he did no such thing. So the Australian military deliberately colluded in creating a political incident which was going to get the Conservatives into government. Now, after that
when would governments ever do that?
It was despicable. They do it all the time, but
Yeah,
it was despicable, and they got found out. But luckily for them, they got found out just after the elections. So 3 years later, when the next election came around, everybody had forgotten except for me.
I think they did that in the Iraq War as well, didn't they? With the hospital and the babies being thrown out of cots. They always use children to kind of. It does seem to me, whenever they want to get something done, they try and create situations where children are involved, so people get emotional, and then they can just about do anything. Then. Yeah,
and in this case, I mean, if you examined the issue in its entirety, what you concluded is, if there was anybody responsible for those kids being in the water, it was the Australian government and the Australian military.
So, were any kids thrown into the ocean or not?
There were kids thrown into the ocean or jumped into the ocean, and there were adults as well. But you know, it was all a setup. It was done for political gain, and the so-called people smuggler really had nothing to do with it. And this is the kind of organisation that the Australian Navy and its counterparts, you know, the Army and the Air Force. This is the kind of organisation they've become. Now, I think there are still people who will join such an organisation because they still believe, despite the evidence, that there is some kind of moral imperative to protect your country. Then you put that person in a war zone. I think for many people, that's going to bring on a kind of disillusionment. You know, you can't ignore the facts any longer, I suppose you could say. And so I think perhaps that is part of the reason why we're seeing this terrible phenomenon of the increased number of suicides among the military.